Clennell, thank you so much for joining me. What was the most interesting thing to come out of the Prime Minister's press conference today? Hour long it was.
Well, I thought there were two things. One was that he finally kind of confirmed we could actually eradicate the virus in Australia, so lower the numbers now. And that's very good news. He said we're basically in front of New Zealand on the numbers, even though we've shut down far less sort of businesses. Our lockdowns haven't been severe, while the shutdowns have been quite severe. They aren't on the New Zealand level. So that's kind of encouraging news. And I guess the other thing is that he really signalled that some restrictions could be lifted in 4 weeks' time, in a month, in mid-May. And that's kind of a contrast to March 18 or mid-March. Around that time, he was saying if we put things in place like school shutdowns, they have to be in place for 6 months. So, you know, you've got to be agile in this crisis, and the Prime Minister's indicating already we're looking at restrictions being lifted, and isn't that a good thing?
It is indeed, but I still can't understand why he can't start recommending the lifting of some restrictions right now. For instance, you know, why we can't lift the restrictions on elective surgery when the hospitals have got thousands of empty beds waiting for coronavirus victims that aren't coming. So I just wonder, you know, is he under some sort of pressure not to admit that perhaps we overreacted, given the uncertainty, of course, with the virus? I'm just wondering whether there's a political imperative to keep this going a little longer.
No, I think Tuesday he said National Cabinet will look at elective surgery, so I would expect him to open up some more beds, and that's obviously very important to a lot of people, and that is good news. I mean, from my point of view, I'd congratulate him thus far. He's put in the JobKeeper subsidy, which is important when you shut the economy down, and he's managed to squash the virus. I mean, obviously every week is a test, and I agree with you that they need to seriously look at lifting some restrictions now, but that will be, as he puts it, a trial and error basis. And I believe that will basically be happening. I think the real contention maybe is schools, and that's a problem with the teachers' unions to some extent, or a large extent, and different states having different approaches. I mean, he obviously wants to open them compulsorily pretty much everywhere, but we're not down that road yet. And where you are in the People's Republic of Victoria, Andrew.
Oh my God! Don't rub it in, mate. Don't rub that in.
They are hardest line on this, and I actually think there's an opportunity here if somewhere like New South Wales open them up a fair amount. They're not talking about opening them up all the way, and New South Wales has the most cases, and then Victoria didn't open them up, and the cases remained the same. It would prove that schools weren't the big issue here. Other things like social distancing and shutting the borders, etc. are. So, look, he also had a number of hurdles to get over, including we should all get this contact tracing app for COVID, apparently, in order to loosen the restrictions, and he wants to crack down on outbreaks like the Army has done in northwest Tasmania. But the mere fact he's saying in a month we're looking at lifting restrictions suggests to me that will happen.
Yes, and I actually think it should be done much, much sooner. Not all of them, of course, but gradually. But I guess there's a political risk in that. But I also think there's a huge political risk in letting this go on so long that the bill will just be enormous. I think that is something that people will spend a couple of years hanging around his neck if it is seen as an overreaction. But Andrew, the other news today, and I know it's got swamped by, obviously, and properly, the coronavirus issue, is Malcolm Turnbull's new book. Now, it's quite extraordinary how details were leaked to at least 3 newspapers that published extensive material from the book, The Guardian, The Australian, and also the Sydney Morning Herald. Basically, it seems to me like it's a hatchet job on Scott Morrison in particular, Mathias Cormann, the Finance Minister, and Home Affairs Minister Peter Dutton, trying to make them all look like untrustworthy, etc., etc. What do you think the agenda is here from Malcolm Turnbull?
Well, I mean, hell hath no fury like a politician scorned, Andrew, and Mathias Cormann, he really scorned him. I mean, he was, you know, he's kind of number 2 man in a lot of respects, is the picture being painted. Certainly they used to call Cormann and Dutton the Praetorian Guard, which kept him in the job. And yet Cormann, you know, quit the cabinet and got up at a press conference and said he's been a great Prime Minister, but I can no longer support him. So that was the end for Malcolm Turnbull. And hasn't he returned serve in this book? You know, essentially what he's saying attempts to drive a wedge between Scott Morrison and Mathias Cormann, his Finance Minister, because there's several insults about Morrison in there from Cormann, and even the suggestion in a text message or WhatsApp message about Scott Morrison, we have a treasurer problem. Now, that might have been in relation to one specific issue. The suggestion is leaking information, but it's very, very damaging. And look, Scott Morrison dismissed it today, rightly so, in terms of he's got bigger things on his mind and he needs to just sweep it aside and forget the past and work with his team. But it must make Mathias Cormann, who didn't comment to me today, but I understand privately denies a lot of the things, but it must make him pretty uncomfortable, you know, working with Scott Morrison at the moment. It's not helpful to him at all. In terms of Scott Morrison, yeah, I mean, he had a good old serve at him, but what would you expect? I guess he replaced him, and Turnbull's not convinced that he was an innocent party in that replacement. He kind of alleges that with Tony Abbott and with him, Morrison did quite a clever political thing, which was support the leader at the time, but have his supporters vote against the leader. So then he was able to say, look, I supported the incumbent all the way through, but Turnbull's alleging he was actually working against the current leader in both those instances. So clearly some bitterness there. We knew there was some bitterness from Turnbull towards Morrison. And the astonishing claim too that he basically helped set up The Guardian in Australia. I think a lot of Liberal supporters would find that quite astonishing. The Guardian, in its ideology, a lot of its reporting in Britain and here is more akin to the Greens than even the Labor Party, Andrew. So I found that quite an astonishing revelation. And lastly, I think to accuse Morrison of leaking, I think Simon Benson pointed out in The Australian today that Turnbull was often accused of leaking against Abbott. So, you know, he who casts the first stone.
Absolutely. I thought it was such an incredible exercise in projection, you know, accusing Malcolm Turnbull of accusing Scott Morrison of double dealing, of being brittle, of being quick to take offence, of being a bully, of being a narcissist. I'm thinking, check, 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 check. You're looking at a mirror, mate.